So what I'm going to tell you about is about a bit about what we have done in Svalbard, which is the Arctic region where Norway has responsibility for the polar bears. And I'm going to tell you something about how we estimated the population size. We did that in 2004. It's something that is important for management to have some ideas about how many bears are around, but even maybe more than that, it's very interesting for people, I think, to know numbers. So everybody, that's what people ask for, you know. That's one of the first questions you get when people ask you about polar bears. How many bears are there around? So it's something media and something like people also want to know. Besides talking about the population size, I'm also going to talk to you a bit about habitat use, going to talk about telemetry methods to see a bit about how polar bears behave. Okay, let's see. Do you have a mouse here? Or?
Spacebar and
where is the arrows here? Yeah. Oh, that's for the press. And can I get back or?
Pointer here.
Yeah.
Go backwards. This.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Yes. Thank you very much. So this map shows the 5 nations that have polar bears, and I'm going fast through this because I think this is a repetition for you. But just to point out our region, this is the Svalbard archipelago. So that's where our polar bears are, and it's fairly far north, from about 77 to 80 degrees north. Barents Sea population here is recognized as one of the 19 polar bear populations today, and it's shared between Russia and Norway. So when we wanted to find out how many bears were around, we had to work together with the Russians in one large survey. This is just to give you a small idea about historically what have happened in Svalbard. Hunting has also been mentioned earlier here, and probably was very important for polar bear populations in many areas. And in Svalbard, it was taken a large number of polar bears over 100 years. Before that, historically, polar bears weren't that interesting for people in Svalbard because it was much more value in killing whales and walruses and bearded seals. But then those went close to extinction, many of them, at least walruses and bowhead whales. So then they start looking for other resources, and then late 1800, polar bears were really hunted heavily, mostly because of good prices of the skins. So if you average this, you can see it's taken about 300 polar bears, that's around Svalbard and a bit west and east of those areas, over to against East Greenland and over to western Russia. So that was mainly taken by Norwegians, and many of them overwintered in Svalbard. And this is too complicated math for me, but if you multiply 300 by 100, you get a huge number at least, so it tells you something about how many bears has been taken out from that population. So that's a lot of bears. Then it was protected in Norway from 1973, and in Russia they protected them already in 1956. And that was, of course, based on the fact that scientists mostly were very concerned about what happened with polar bears if those really excessive hunting would continue, and hunting methods got more and more efficient. In Svalbard they had something called self-shots. That meant that the bears actually went and took a bait and shot itself. That also means that this is a low estimation of the number of bears killed, because many bears would have been killed without being found. So this is based on how many skins were imported into Norway. So if we have to talk a bit about, it's important when you want to measure a population that you know what the population is. So just a few words about how we recognize Barents Sea to be one population. It's based partly on genetics. And if you see these color codes here, they tell how different those different populations of polar bears are. Actually, altogether, it's very, very little differentiation genetically of polar bears in different Arctic areas, which reflects that they are very able to move a lot. But if you look here, between Svalbard, it's very little extinction between Svalbard and Franz Josef Land, which is this group of islands here. It's actually also very little differentiation between East Greenland and Svalbard, which is a bit difficult to understand for us, because if we look at telemetry data, we have very little overlap. So this is positions from bears. All those are mainly marked in Svalbard and had got colors there. Those are from Greenland, and those are marked in Western Russia. And you see it's very few positions in between here, so it's probably not a lot of movement, but still it has to be enough that you can get a low genetic differentiation between those populations. And it is quite a bit subjective what are populations, but you have to make some choices. And based on those sources, and maybe more than anything about data from tracking of polar bears, we have decided that the Barents Sea area is one population. And as you can see here, it also overlaps quite a lot with this northern Kara Sea population from Western Russia. Has to be said though that this is based on very few individuals, and also that probably population delineations will change based on your data all the time too, because it's a bit of subjectivity in it. However, that's what we decided. So when you want to decide how many polar bears there are in a population, there are several methods, and capture-recapture is maybe the one that has been used most, also earlier on polar bears. You capture bears and you go back later and you recapture bears, and given that you have the same probability of capturing any bears any season, and that you know something about the survival rate, you can use that to get some estimates. In some areas, it's not that useful. For example, in Svalbard and over to Russia, we have the problem that it's difficult to get access to the Russian Arctic, and it's large areas where it's very difficult to get at all up in the pack ice. So we can get good capture data from Svalbard, but not from the Russian areas, and that's why we decided that we had to do something else, both because of logistics and economy. So what we decided was that we were to make one large helicopter survey in the Barents Sea and looking for polar bears from helicopter. Fortunately, at the Polar Institute, we have our own ship, and that makes the price of a survey like that much cheaper for us. So we used Lanse, which is a very good vessel for going in ice in that survey. And that was done in August 2004, so we chose to do it in a period where the ice was quite far north, so we could get around. And we had a helicopter on board. What is a huge challenge when you do surveys like this is actually that you don't get good weather most of the time. Along the ice edge, the pack ice, you get usually bad weather actually. And it's very dangerous to fly when you have bad weather. One thing is that you get icing, and then if you get too much ice on the blades of the helicopter, it falls down, and that's bad. Very bad, actually. So what we did also was that we had two teams of observers when we did this survey. And observers are a pilot and one observer in the other seat, and one on each side back. So we have 4 people, 8 eyes that can look for bears. And we had 2 teams and we had 2 pilots. So when it was nice weather, we flied almost all the time. Our record actually over at Franz Josef was that we were in the air with the helicopter 21 hours within a 24-hour period. So you could be very efficient when it was good weather. So we did that for 1 month, and we had another helicopter in Svalbard on the islands that did a separate study over 3 weeks. So we flied a lot. We had to do it in the same time to be sure that the bears hadn't moved, from one place to the other, because they have seasonal movement. So this is approximately the area we decided that we would maybe have to cover, depending on where the sea ice was. So this is Svalbard. So one helicopter was based here and did all the service here. And then Lanse went over here and along the pack ice and did all the service over to Franz Josef Land. There is one method that is probably the best to use when you want to do something like this, fly helicopter, because you can't see all the bears from the helicopter. You couldn't cover all the area. So you have to fly in some strips, and you have to estimate, depending on how much of the area we've covered, how many bears there are. Given that you believe that you see all the bears just underneath the helicopter, you can make a curve like this. So the further away from the helicopter you get, the lower is the probability of seeing a bear. And then, for example, if this is 100-meter distances, if this is 900 meters or something, this is the whole area that you use, and you cover this part of it, and you just calculate how many bears there would have been out to 1 kilometer. But it depends that you see all the bears on the line or close to the helicopter, or if not, that you know how large a proportion you actually see. If you know that you see exactly half of them, you can just multiply by 2. So that's the most common way to it's called line transects. That's the common way to estimate. So this is the helicopter we used. This is the Svalbard helicopter that has marked a lot of bears and been used for a lot of surveys. So you fly and you measure the distance out to the bear, and the way we did that was that we used a GPS, and you just downloaded the track of the helicopter, and then when you spotted the bear, you saw exactly where it was, and usually could also see foot tracks from where it started to run, if it ran. And then we flied over to the bear, and we took a GPS position there and went back to the line and continued flying. Also, it helps a lot when you estimate if you can sort of say how large probability there is to detect a bear depending on what sort of habitat you have covered, because then you can fit different sort of detection lines to different habitats. So we did this on land, where it's very easy to see bears. And it's less easy to see them in the pack ice or fast ice bound to land, or on glaciers, for obvious reasons, I guess. This is just some stats telling, just to show you a bit about how much habitat we covered in different sorts. So I sort of transformed this to number of hours that we would have flown if we had 100 knots, which was our preferred speed when we fly. However, when you fly out to all the bears, and we also did what you call total count in some areas where it was impractical to do line transects. We just counted the number of bears on small islands, for example. And it's a lot of transport. So altogether we flied more than 200 hours in this survey, so it's a lot of flying. As you see, we covered mostly ice, less land and glacier, and this is the total number of kilometers covered with line transects. In addition to that, it's all the other flying we did. So it's a lot of flying. You get very tired actually flying. It's most fun the first 100 hours you fly helicopter. After a while it gets quite boring actually. You agree, Andy? Sometimes, at least if you see few bears. If it takes 2-3 hours between each bear you see, you have to be really, alert and, to try to be sure to make a good job. So this is sort of different sort of histograms you get in different sort of habitats. And just to make that short story, this is when you pull all of them together. And so this sort of data is the data you put into some program to get some numbers of the bear in the population. However, it almost never goes as planned. And our problem was actually that when you get to the sea ice, we planned to fly about 100 nautical miles north of the sea ice, and this was based on telemetry data that we knew that very rarely you find bears from Svalbard further north than 85 miles or something north of the ice edge. That was based on telemetry data we already had, and that's independent on how far north or south the ice edge is. Due to bad weather, it was a gap here in the Russian side that we couldn't cover, and you had all these areas further north here that we would have liked to cover but didn't cover. So we had to do something with that. And what we did was to use telemetry positions from a lot of different years, and then use that to sort of find out how many bears we would have missed. So comparing telemetry data, the distribution of that data with the distribution of all the data in the areas we covered, you get what's called a ratio. So you see that, okay, maybe 30% or something would have been outside rather than inside. And you get some uncertainty in that, and that's partly based on how much misfit you have in those areas where you actually have covered. In the areas here, you see, for example, that we observed more bears here than you should have suspected from the telemetry data, and that adds to the uncertainty in the estimate. Actually explains partly why this uncertainty in the estimate we got is quite big. So that estimate is based both on the areas we covered and those that we didn't cover. And the result, the number we got, was that we think we might have 2,650 bears, or had that in August 2004, but with an uncertainty of 95% confidence interval, that we're like 95% sure that it's between 1,900 and 3,600, given that all the assumptions we did was correct. So that's the estimate we have for the population of the Barents Sea. Now, if we divide that between Norway and Russia, you see that in August that year it was many more bears in Russia, here about 2,000, than compared to Norway. But this varies a lot between years. In many years there are a lot more bears in Svalbard than that was that year. It was almost no bears, or it was probably only a couple of hundred bears in Svalbard in August that year. And that has a lot to do with the ice conditions, how fast the ice disappears and so on. In the pack ice north of Norway, it's much lower densities. You can see that here than it is on the Russian side. And that's mostly because it's much shallower water and more productive areas in Russia. So many of our Svalbard bears, they go east, northeast to the Russian area to feed. And this is just a small figure showing the probability of meeting bears if you fly 100 kilometers, showing on Franz Josef Land. We encounter a lot of bears, up to 6 per 100 kilometers when you fly it on land. Altogether, it was a lot of bears there. If you go to Norwegian pack ice, very low, Russian pack ice, much higher. Interestingly, you also have quite a few bears on the glaciers. So actually, we had about 300 bears on glaciers that year, which was surprising to me. Just show you a few figures from earlier. This is what we call, a lot of it, guesstimates, because the 2004 is the only real estimate we have for the whole area. And what you see is that earlier it was actually some guesstimates that it was more bears around than we had in the 80s compared to now, but I think it was probably an overestimation back then. I think most indications we have is that it's at least as many bears today as it was around 1980. But for sure, the population increased a lot from, they were protected from the 70s and for the next 10 years, and probably even increased a bit later. And I don't know what's happening today. You have to ask somebody else. One interesting thing when you think about surveying population is that actually, because they have so many cubs, the population size vary quite a lot over the season. So we will get many more bears if you do a survey in April than if you do it in October, because a lot of them die over the year and they get newborn every spring. You don't see those in the figures of population sizes, but most of them, I guess, are done in the summer or spring to autumn. But even on that scale, it will vary a bit. What can we use the estimate for? You can add to other subpopulations to tell how many bears there are in Arctic. For ecosystem studies, of course, it's interesting how many seals are killed by polar bears, what's the impact on the ecosystem. You can compare them with earlier and future estimates, and it has limitations because of the uncertainty and also because we don't have any good estimates from earlier. And then, of course, could have some importance for possible influence on other subpopulations, for example, or other populations like East Greenland or the Kara Sea. So now I'm going to tell you a bit more about other things based on telemetry and studies we have done that tells us a bit about behavior. Not from observing bears, because we haven't done that a lot, but more from things that have happened after we marked them and put on equipment. So it has a few decades of history by using collars, and it has happened quite a lot with the collars, as I also will tell you a bit about. So this is a collar that was probably put on 5, 6, 7 years ago or something in Svalbard. it's only the females that get colors. The males have such a broad neck, so they will just throw it off. That has been tried. If you want to study males, you need to attach a transmitter in a different way, for example, in the ear or something like that. But then battery capacity would necessarily be much lower. Anyway, I think it's more important to know what the females do than the males. So we usually restrict studies on telemetry to females. And I think by now it's must be maybe 350 colors or something that has been put on colors in Svalbard, so it's a lot of data after all these years. So this figure you already have seen, and I show it to again, because this is a study made by Mevritz et al. 2002, so this is Andy's time, before I came. And these lines show 60, 70, and 80% probability of a bear being assigned to an area to be within that area at a certain time. And what you see here is this striking thing that you have this thing in Svalbard here, where you have these small circles, but at the same time, overlapping, you have this barren sea thing. And as I briefly also told you yesterday, this is because we have two very different type of strategies, habitat strategies in Svalbard. So you have bears that walk a lot, and they might return to Svalbard, for example, to go into den or to mate, but they are over to Franz Josef part of the year and have huge home range areas. Then you have Svalbard bears, and they can be very local, staying in very small areas in Svalbard. So that's very important thing we found out, because it's huge implications, of course, for management and for what we think happens if things happen with the sea ice, because it's very different scenarios for those local ones or from those that are part of the year up in the pack ice. So this is just examples of 3 bears. Actually, this track here is 3.5 years of data. This is 1 year of data. So they just show how different the home ranges can be. So this is just all the positions with lines in between. And we have quite a few of those very local bears. You find them exactly the same place. The problematic thing, of course, is that if you're only out in April every year, as I usually am, then you might find a bear like this too in exactly the same place every year, and you don't know where it's been in between. That's why it's important to put on colors. This figure is a figure that shows, based on all telemetry positions, it shows something about probability of finding bears in certain area, and it's divided by seasons. And what it shows in Svalbard is that you have many bears around here from a bit before New Year and out to the spring, and then they start expanding, and in the summer many of those bears have gone up to Franz Josef and in the pack ice. Of course, this story will change if you don't have sea ice that they can walk on. Then they have to decide, if they want to be somewhere else and not come back, or what they do. But this is based on data from maybe 20 years of data on polar bears. But what it shows very clearly is that it's very season dependent where you find the bears. And around Svalbard you will have many more bears in the winter, spring than you will have the rest of the year. What we also know though is that in summer it varies a lot between years how many bears are there. Some of the locals are always there, but some of the others might be catched there if sea ice retreats too fast. What else? We have found some other things using telemetry data. The last few years we've got much more detailed data. The GPS data, when we started using that, tells us exactly where the bears have been. The same with the sea ice, we get much more fine data on where the sea ice is. We used this, and in one paper it was demonstrated that females in Svalbard, they use the glacier fronts a lot. That's also interesting because the glaciers, it happens a lot with the glaciers in Svalbard too. They retrets very fast. And in front of those glaciers, what you get is sea ice that gets out from the glacier in the water. It freezes, so you get a lot of structures, and the ringed seals allow that because they need snow to make layers for their cubs. And that's why front of glaciers are very attractive for bears to hunt in spring when they have small ringed seals that are easy to catch, and sometimes they might catch the mothers too when they've got cubs. What we found though was that particularly females with small cubs, they used these glacier fronts more than other bears. So it's very important for females when they just come out from the dens and are very hungry and need food very fast to ensure the survival of the small cubs. This is just a track. This last year we got something called iridium callers. That means that they actually, the bears have a telephone and they just call us and tell where they are, and they do this all the time, and we can even call the bear and ask him, for example, the bear to call more frequently or less frequently. And you get more frequent positions than we used to do. So this is based on positions every hour, and you can really see where the bears have walked. So this was marked this spring, and here actually had a den here and had 2 cubs, and it walked over here the whole round, came back here in the late summer. So it's a few months of tracks, but it gives us some possibilities to study, detailed use of sea ice and also behavior much more in detail than we did. So this is another example from the same sort of color. So this bear was over here. It went the whole way up here, up to the pack ice here, came back here, and then in August it came back here, and it just stayed in this fjord here. And what we found was this strange pattern here, and then we were out in September and captured the female, and it was a dead whale carcass here. So that's, you could almost have guessed that from this track. This is, between the high and low tide, and you can wonder what should the bear do that all the time. So that's the mother and the cub when we recapture them. So you can use those colors for when you have so many and precise positions. You can use them to tell those things. This is another example. This is a female, and we tested these iridium colors. I employed 2 of those colors, 10th of September last year. And this bear, it went into a den here, 17th October. But on the 6th of November, it just left the den. 4 days later, it got into a new den here. And you can see from temperatures, you can see that it's been in den. So that was a bit strange. I did this actually, made this figure just before I went here to have something to show you. And what I found out then was that actually you have, if you look at the data, so this is from meteorological station quite close, you see that you had a mild spell just in the period when it went from that first den. Very mild, many 6 degrees almost Celsius. So maybe something happened with that then. Then it came a terrible mild spell with a lot of rain. They say it's something that they were supposed to happen every 200 years or something. So they got 3 times as much rain in New Ålesund, which is a bit west of where this bear was, in 1 day compared to what's the average for 1 month, that period of year. And high temperatures. And then we lost a lot of the signals of the bear, probably because the den was glaciated. Later, for some reason, he suddenly left the den for, I think, 2 hours or something, 1 or 2 hours, and came back, 3 hours it left the den, and 1 kilometer away, and come back into the den. And then it left the den 5th of March, and that's quite early, a bit earlier than what they used to, and that is just when you had a new mild spell. And when we recaptured her, she was lactating, so she had cubs, but she was alone. So this might indicate what could happen, or give at least some hypothesis of how you can study how these mild periods might work on polar bear denning. I told you we marked 2 bears that 10th of September and put colors on, so this is the other one. This was extremely skinny. She was 142 kilos or something, and the cubs were only 22 kilos or something, about the size of a big cub in April. And she didn't lactate anymore. She died in November, probably. That's when the color transmitted from one place, and we found her next spring. So again, that's some sort of data that the colors can give us. A bit about swimming. we've had some colors that record whether or not the bear are in water. And I think swimming, knowing something about the swimming behavior of bears are very important, particularly when we talk about climate and what happens when you get less sea ice. This is 4 colors that have given at least 1 year of data. And these 2 things that are striking. One is that it varies a lot, and that they in periods swim a lot, because this is % of time in water. So we see in periods they can be like 20% of the time in water. That's a lot. Other bears, that's the other thing, is that it's huge variation between the bears. So other bears hardly swim at all. So that I think is 2 things that are important to know. That they potentially can swim a lot, but it's huge variation in how much they are in the water. Another thing that we found regarding swimming is that females, this is females with cubs, small cubs, this is without cubs, and Andy told you that small cubs, they don't like water. They actually get chilled down very, very fast if they're in water, so this is cheating actually. And what you see from the figures there is that mothers with small cubs, they are much less in water than females without cubs, particularly in spring when it's very, very cold in the water. That's also important to know, because it means that females with small cubs, they have problems when they don't have sea ice so they can get to the hunting areas. They can't just swim, at least not for large distances. We have also used data to look at denning. So this is a map of dens in Svalbard, and in Svalbard they are found in very restricted areas, most of the den, and that's because of the topography. It's not a lot of snow in Svalbard, and you need places where the snow accumulates. That's why you have specific denning areas. And one study that was led by Andy from Hopen here showed very clearly that if you don't have sea ice around Hopen in the autumn, then you hardly get any dens there. The same pattern seems to be emerging in Kongsøya. We had people there the last few years. So there is maybe the most significant thing we have seen, if there are anything on impacts on climate so far in Svalbard, is that they struggle to get to the traditional denning areas in bad sea ice years, because they just don't get sea ice corridors to walk over there. A lot of these denning positions and where bears are is also based on telemetry data. We have also started using a bit of other sort of tools to try to tell more about behavior, and a lot of that is focused on denning, because I personally think that denning is very, very important. What is, I'm not sure if that has been told clearly yet for you or not, but it's a huge difference between brown bears and polar bears, that polar bears, they go into den when they have cubs. They don't go into dens as brown bears when they don't have cubs. Or if they do it for short periods of time when it's bad weather, for example, but not for 4 or 5 months. So that means that if you know that females have been in den, then you can tell something about reproduction. So one thing we did a few years ago, and that was first because we wanted to have more detailed data about swimming. We put on what's called time depth recorders. The temperature depth recorders, they record when the bears are swimming. But they also, this small thing here, records the light level. So we found out when we looked at them that actually you can see whether or not the bears have been in the dens. So you see here where it starts here, you can see periods where they've been into den, where there's very, very little light. Of course, it's dark in some months of the autumn, so if you see this is what the light looks like if they're outside the den. It gets quite dark, but not as dark as inside the den. However, you need a color to glue that onto. The alternative we found out we were to use was to use something less invasive that you could use in the ear tags, because they already have ear tags. So on birds, it's done a lot of studies where you have what's called geolocation tags. They're usually meant to tell where the birds fly, because if you know when the sun rises and goes down, you can tell something about that. But we glue this onto the ear tags, and we did that last year. We did that on 27 females to try to see, and those sensors are less sensible than those, but we still, by some pilot studies, when I tried them out, found out that they should be sufficient. And, that was, I don't know what that was, blank slide. So this is example of 3 recovered females. So what I did was I plotted for 3 females that we already know what have done. So this female has certainly not been denning because she had 3 cubs. So these small C's means cubs. Female just means it's a mother that has got these ear tags. And this Y means it's a yearling. So this one of the 3 cubs survived. So she hasn't been in den. And you see here that the light disappears around 1st of November. It gets very dark in Svalbard. And you see it starts coming back in early February, and that's quite a lot before polar bears leave the dens, so using that should be sufficient. Then we have another that we knew had been in den because she was alone in 2011, and we captured her with a small cub, actually now in September. And what you see then is very similar in the autumn, so you can't tell much, but in the spring you can see that she's probably looked a bit out of the den. Maybe she just made some air conditioning thing or something, so the roof was thin, I don't know. And then she was probably briefly out here. She was a bit in and out, and she left the den here a few days out in April. So it seems like it's working okay. The good thing with these ear tags, geolocation tags, is that the battery and the memory lasts for 5 to 10 years, probably closer to 10, given that they don't use a lot of memory when they don't record much in the winter. So the idea is that if you recapture bears after a few years, you can get reproductive history of those bears. Then we have this female, and that's the one I just showed you, that left prematurely, and then you can see here that it gets light earlier than it really should, around Mars. They shouldn't really leave the den before, let's say mid-Mars or something, and most of them around early April. So that's a tool that we hope that can provide us with a lot of demographic data in the future. This is actually the end, so I just wanted to show you a picture with wind and cold weather.